And I don't know why, but I started thinking about bonds last night, and I wanted to outline how the United States is in a bit of a pickle. So the reason I started looking into this is because I bought maybe 5, 6 months ago, I bought some bonds, some US bonds. And for those who don't know what a bond is it is an IOU for a country. Think of it like a credit card, where if you buy something with your credit card, you have to pay back the purchase over time with interest, right? So let's say you went out to eat, it cost $100, and then assume you don't pay it off at the end of the month, you have to pay interest on that. A lot of credit cards, they have interest of maybe 20%. So over time, if you paid off that $100 meal over the course of a year, you would pay $120, right? Countries have similar things. The interest rate is much lower than 20%, but they're dealing with much bigger numbers, where you're dealing with $100 here, $100 there, maybe $1,000 or $10,000 if you're really bad with money, and you're paying interest on that. Countries, they're not dealing with hundreds or thousands, they're dealing with literally trillions of dollars. So I know trillion doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's just this huge amorphous number. But I like to think in terms of percentages on these things. So if you look at the United States and how they spend their money, they get money in. Pretty much the only way that they get money in is through taxes, right? So you're a government, people pay the taxes or tariffs, whatever, and you have that pot of money and you have to allocate it and spend it on things, right? So there's certain things that the government will spend on, right? The biggest chunk is entitlement spending. So that's going to be like your Social Security, your Medicare, your Medicaid, basically health insurance for all the people who are either old or can't afford it. And then military is a big chunk, although smaller. And then another really big chunk that people don't think about is interest on the national debt. So the government, when they spend money, typically, actually almost always, they spend more money than they get in taxes. So they need to make up that money somehow, right? So the way they do that is they essentially just print more money, and they will borrow money from you and me and other countries, right? So the way they borrow the money is through a bond, which I was just explaining. So the way it works is the country will issue a bond, they will sell it, we will pay for it, right? So I will give the country my money, and then the US government will pay back the bond with interest over time. And I think it's like 20% ish. I have to double check the numbers, but it's around 20% of all the government spending is just paying these interest on the debt that they have. So it's interesting because it's not just individual people who hold it, but a lot of it is with countries, other countries that hold the debt. So, for example, China I think is a pretty good example. The United States has gone through years and years of offshoring, right? So when I say outshoring, offshoring, I mean like outsourcing, right? So where there used to be a bunch of factories in, let's say, the Midwest, you've got your Rust Belt, you had all of these car factories, all these manufacturing places. A lot of those companies, they didn't want to pay for the really high US wages. So they said, hey, let's move all of our manufacturing to China, to India, to Vietnam, to wherever, right? To Japan. And now these US companies were paying all of these companies in other countries in US dollars. So then all of these countries, or the companies in the countries, and also the countries themselves, because they got taxes as well, they had all this US dollars, right? So now you can't necessarily spend US dollars in China, so you have to do something with it. So what the Chinese government or Chinese people would do is they would go and they would buy US debt. They would buy US bonds because it'd be something you could do with your US dollars. And if you want to buy $1 trillion of US bonds, you can, right? Because the US dollar is the most widely used currency on earth. I think it's around 60% ish of all transactions. I need to double check that, but 50-60% of all worldwide transactions happen in the US dollar. It's the biggest currency on earth by far. A lot of US dollars are used outside the United States between different countries because they know they can trust it. So what's happened is over time, because the United States has outsourced so much money, now big holders of US debt are not actually inside the United States, but they're outside of the United States. And the problem is the US debt is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger as a percentage of the spending. So the US debt is 36 trillion. That's not actually important. The important thing is that it's a really high percentage of all of the income that they actually got in, which puts the US in a really bad position. Because if they're already spending more, right? So the United States is already spending more money than they get in, right? So if they spend more money that they get in, and most of the debt is held by foreign countries, the United States needs to find a way to pay that debt back. And there's only really a couple ways you can do it. One, you can go and you can do austerity measures. So you could cut your Social Security, you could cut your Medicare to whatever to pay back so for reference, right? The entire US military spending right now is roughly equal to the interest on the national debt. So if you cut down your military spending to zero, which I think would not be very politically popular, they could pay off the national debt. But realistically, you wouldn't just cut down to zero, you cut down from a little bit everywhere. But if you look at what's happening in Congress right now, that is not happening, right? So I think they just passed or are working on passing some sort of bill which is going to increase spending. So it seems like Congress is incapable. Like, this is not a political thing. This is just literally a look at the numbers, and they are spending more money than they get in, right? So they need to get the money from somewhere, and then that will just increase the national debt more. So that's an issue. The second thing that the US could do, so austerity probably won't work. It'd be very politically unpopular and may not be able to happen. Now that would be one way to do it. You just cut spending. Two that you could do is you could print more money. So the United States will probably never technically default on its national debt because it can literally just turn on the money printers and then print more. But then the problem with that is you will devalue the currency, right? Because if you think about all the US dollars that are floating around, if you double the number of US dollars that are floating around in order to pay off the debt or whatever, things are going to get more expensive. So that's why we got all the inflation during COVID time, right? Because the US government, they started printing a bunch of money, and then things just went up, right? I mean, look how expensive eggs are and everything, right? It's just everything got more expensive because there's just more money floating around. And then the final thing, which maybe works, maybe doesn't, is if you can grow the pie, right? So the final thing you could do is to say, hey, US companies just need to go and get better, build more stuff, sell to other countries, and then the tax revenue would increase, and then there's just more money floating around. But I think that's very hard to do because the United States is already so overvalued in terms of the stock market. So if you look at the entire world, right, the US I think is it's about 4% of the world's population is the US. But in terms of the actual money floating around in the stock market, you're closer to 60%, right? Something like that. So there isn't really, in my opinion, a lot of room to go up for the US just because it's already so high. And also, the US is really, really concentrated to just a couple companies, right? So if you look at the overall US stock market, the bulk of the US stock market is the FANGs, right? So you got your Facebook or your Meta, you got your Amazon, your Apple, your Nvidia, your Microsoft. You got these really big tech companies. I think, what do they call it? The Magnificent Seven. The Magnificent Seven stocks, which make up a really large percentage of the stock. And most of them are really, really, in my opinion, overvalued. And a lot of the valuation is around AI, and I think that the AI, it will change the world, but it's also maybe a little bit overvalued right now, potentially. So I think that it could cause a lot of these companies to dip and then to keep dipping, which would make the actual overall US market just go down, right? And there's also a lot of headwinds, right? So, like, the biggest company right now in the United States is Apple, and Apple is dealing with a lot of tariff issues. So, it's very possible that for a short period of time, the Apple and whatnot may shrink in market cap, just shrinking the US's overall global dominance. Anyways, with all that being said, I think that it's very difficult for the United States to outgrow their spending problem, right? So they have this big debt load that it would be nice if they could grow the GDP, they could grow the pie, increase tax revenue, and then pay it all off. But I think, well, that would be the ideal scenario. It may be a little bit unlikely that you're going to be able to massively grow these already really big companies and pay off enough tax revenue, right? So I think that austerity probably won't work because it'd be very politically unpopular. So I think that the only thing that will likely happen is the US will print just more US currency, and that will devalue the dollar, right? And also potentially cause inflation. And then the other issue that the US is having right now is because the US is also getting an issue where it's being seen as a safe haven asset less and less. So the interest on the debt is increasing. So right now, I think the interest rate on the US debt is hovering around 5%, which is really, really, really high. So a couple of years ago, the interest rate on the debt was, I mean, honestly, close to 0%, right? If you look at a lot of the countries in the world, a lot of these Western nations had really, really low interest rates on their debt. So their debt level was sustainable. And even though the debt level isn't that much bigger than it was in the past, the interest rate is way higher. So as a percentage of spending, it's much, much more. So what does that mean? Well, that means that in the very, very near future, or honestly, even right now, the debt level in the United States is just becoming completely unsustainable. So the United States needs to do something to get their interest rates down to make the payments more manageable. So I think what they're trying to do is the United States is trying to strong arm some other countries to buy more of the debt, right? Because if you can have more people trying to buy the debt, that would bring the interest rates down, right? Because, classic supply and demand curve, you have more people trying to buy the debt, the price of the bonds would go up, and then that would actually bring the interest rates down. So there's like an inverse correlation there. So, but if a lot of people don't want to buy the debt, right? If they think it's a toxic asset, right? The interest rate's going to go up. So, for example, right, if you have a credit card and you have a really low credit score, right? Let's say you're broke as a joke and you have a $500 credit limit, your credit card is going to have a really high interest rate. You might be paying 30% on your credit card, right? And if you have a really high credit score, you have a good credit card, you might be paying a much lower rate. Maybe you're paying your 10% on your credit card, right? So if people think that the United States is going to be a less of a safe haven, I should say, like if people think that the United States is less of a safe haven, then they will spend more, they will demand a higher interest rate. And right now, the problem is the interest rate for the US debt is going up, which is a big problem. And all of the a lot of the other allies and the people who would be open to buying US debt, their interest rates are also going up at the same time. So, for example, Japan typically had a really, really low interest rate. Japan had one of the lowest interest rates in the world. It was actually negative for a while. So they had a little bit of excess money. But now Japan has super bad demographics, huge Asian society. They just don't have as much money to buy US debt. The United States is going in an all out trade war with China. China has no political will to buy US debt. China has no political will to buy US debt. The United States needs not individuals, because individuals don't have enough money. Unless you're Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett actually holds a really high percentage, I think it's like a couple percent of US debt. I think it's like 5% or something. But regardless, there's almost nobody on earth other than countries who can buy enough US debt to pay this off. And also, because the United States is slapping a bunch of tariffs on all these countries, the countries will have less US money coming in because a lot of companies are going to be bringing back manufacturing and whatnot to the United States. Potentially, some of them are going out of business, whatever, which means that a lot of these countries are going to have less money to buy US debt. So what does that all mean, right? So I know I've said a lot of things here. It basically means that the United States is in a very precarious position, right? So I bought some bonds and I'm regretting it because the interest rate has gone higher, which means the value of my bonds have gone down. Plus, I'm really worried that the United States is going to start devaluing its currency because as I mentioned, I don't think austerity is going to work. I don't think that growing the pie is going to work much. And I think the only thing that the United States is going to be able to do is just print more money. So even though the bonds, they will be paid back, the US dollar, since there'll just be more floating around, will be worth a lot less. So if you have a currency which is decreasing in value, if you own US bonds, you're essentially betting that the US dollar is going to be worth something in 30 years. But if the US dollar is devalued by 50% in order for the US to pay off its national debt, the bonds would be really, really bad. So I'm really regretting buying some of the bonds that I have right now because I just don't think that the currency is going to be worth much. So it's possible that you could go buy stocks, right? But I think that the stocks right now in the United States are already like pretty high, right? They're potentially overvalued. Now, the stocks may go up in nominal terms because if you devalue the currency, then people have to go and then buy assets, right? So your things like your stocks may go up, but it's a pretty tough position. So, anyways, with all that being said, I think that the assets that will do well in this time of currency devaluation will be the assets that aren't necessarily tied to companies or countries, ones that are separate from that. So that maybe be things like your land, your gold, your Bitcoin, your oil, your hard assets. Those types of commodities, they may do really, really well in this time because no matter how much currency is devalued, people will always need bread, right? So your loaf of bread may cost $5,000, but if you're a baker and you've got that bread, people are going to need to eat. So take that for what you will, but the scarce assets, those are the things that are going to probably increase in price. Did you guys like this? If you did, like, comment, and subscribe. If you agree with me, give it a thumbs up. If you think that I am full of it, let me know why. Please be specific. I would love to know why, because I don't know, man. We're all just trying to figure this out together. This is just my current read on the market. So, and if you think I'm wrong, let me know why. I'd love to figure out where my blind spots are. Catch you in the next one.